started taking aspirin, and my head just kept hurting, and so I kept taking aspirin all day, like every 4 hours, 2 aspirin, and I started hallucinating. I don't know I just had no idea what was going on. My husband came in to see me a couple days later, and I said, honey, I think I'm dying. And he looked at the bottle that I was taking, and he said, honey, that's Ambien. And so last night when I got into the hotel, I actually kind of did the same thing. So if I fall off the stage or do something really dumb, it's my fault. I got in at about 1:30, and I'm still a little bit high, so sorry. So let me introduce myself. I am, I guess, like the grandmother of security. I started in this field about 25 years ago, and when I think about how long ago that was, oh my God. I was actually a network engineer, and I was crimping lines, and actually one of the intelligence agencies in the US. And at the time, this intel agency, you know how smart this particular organization was, they were implementing Microsoft Proxy Server as their firewall solution. And they didn't know how to do it, so asked me if I could do it, and I was like, yeah, fine, whatever, I can configure the router, I can put this in. And lo and behold, I became a security expert. So I did that for a little bit and ended up going to a startup, and I was an ethical hacker. So I was one of you guys for several years. Did some consulting, started a company, sold the company to IBM, had lots of interesting roles at IBM, one of which was Chief Security Officer, which I did for several years. And now I've most recently left IBM, this is as of a few months ago, to join a company called Acuity, which I'm really not going to talk about very much, a little bit at the end, but that's more within the context of machine learning. Suffice to say, I am a pragmatist. And so people have said kind of cynical, maybe not cynical, just, shall we say, experienced. And so as I'm speaking to you today, what we're going to be speaking about is privacy and security and the challenges that interpreting the requirements of both have brought to us. We're going to be talking about some pretty dicey stuff. I'm going to be asking you some questions. We're going to do some audience participation as part of this. But my goal today is to be representative of what one of your bosses looks like. I mean, I am a CISO by trade. So I am the person that is kind of making the decisions. And so I want you to understand how I think and how I think about the topics of privacy and security, how I weigh and prioritize what I do, why I do it, how much I spend on it, as well as to tell you about some of the things that I and others in my field, CISOs in my field, are really thinking about and investing in today. All right, so with that, let's talk about privacy. Now, I've got a definition up here. I can tell you that throughout my career, I could sit in rooms 100 times bigger than this one, and if I were to put a gun against everybody's head, not one of them would be able to give me a good definition of what privacy is. I look at this, privacy is a fundamental human right. What does that actually mean? I mean, seriously, how do you create regulation around that? How do you interpret from a security perspective what that means? Why are we talking about it so much? In many Western nations, in many countries in Asia, in some countries in South America, we think about privacy. The reality is, with privacy though, privacy is a really messy subject. There is no one definition, universal definition of privacy that anyone adheres to. Do you know that in the US, it is not a constitutional right? In India, it is not a constitutional right. In Ireland, privacy, the fundamental right to protect one's liberty, is not a constitutional right. Every country, for the most part, has different definitions of what it means. Even in the US, we have 50 states. 49 states have some form of privacy legislation, all which define privacy in different ways. So we have 49 regulations defining what is privacy. That's insane. Now, when you look at privacy within the context of the millennial generation, you guys sitting in this room, it means something completely different. And my job as a CISO, going back to the pragmatic part of me, is to understand what it means, because you know what? You guys now represent the bulk of my workforce. When I'm hiring somebody in your age bracket, 18 to 35 years old. And I've got to think about how you work, how you consider information, how you manipulate that information, because I am not going to be successful if I don't take that into account. So when I think about security, when I think about privacy, and I think about the mess that those two things create, it kind of gives me a little bit of a headache. So let me ask you a quick question, quick vote. This is true statistic based on something the Direct Marketing Association asked, and I typically don't put a lot of credence in these kinds of statistics, but this one I actually think is pretty true based on the control group that they assessed. So what percentage of millennials would give away their personal information for a better online shopping experience? How many of you would vote 1? How many of you would vote 2? How many of you would vote 3? Okay, answer is actually 1. And every other stat, this is the lowest stat I could find. Most other stats will show it up at about 86%. Do you know what that drops to? People my age bracket drops down to like less than 5%. There is a huge generational gap when it comes to what it means to maintain personal information. Now, let's talk about what is personal information and what is privacy. You know, particularly among, again, millennial generation, this is the future of the workplace. This is the future of my customer base. I've got to think about how you work and why you work in order for me to do a good job. So when I think about privacy today, what is privacy? Okay, fundamental right, that's great. And how many of you believe it is a fundamental right? Interesting. Some of you, I don't know whether you're so bored out of your minds you're not raising your hands, or you actually don't know. How many of you are unsure of what it means? Anybody want to proffer an opinion as to an alternative? No? All right, let me tell you what I think it means. In today's day and age, what is privacy? I have 4 kids, one of which actually taught me what privacy was. She is, I'm not even going to tell you how old she is now, but anyway, we were talking one day and she said to me, I've got this really big problem. And I said, what? She said, well, Noni, that's her grandmother, she friended me on Facebook. And I said, yeah. She said, I don't know what to do. If I say yes, she's going to see what I'm doing on the weekends, and she's going to be really mad. And if I say no, I'm going to hurt her feelings. I said, okay. So that's a big quandary. I don't know what to tell you, honey. You go do what you think is right. And you go talk to your Noni if you're going to say no. I'm not telling her. She said, okay, well, let me think about it. She came back, and she said, you know what? I figured it out. I said, well, what did you decide to do? She said, I friended her, but what I found is that in Facebook, I'm able to control the choices of what kind of data she can see, so I can restrict her profile. And I said, that's it. That's privacy. Privacy today, if you go back to fundamental right, privacy is an individual right. So privacy is my individual right, your individual right, to control our data when we provide it to a third-party organization. And I'll give you in a nutshell what that means, because I've done a broad assessment of privacy regulations, and I've tried to distill the requirements down so that you can see exactly what it means and where security fits. But suffice to say, I believe that privacy is an individual right, that I can control my information once I've given it to a third party. And most millennials share that same opinion. Now, when it comes to the countries which are responsible for understanding the way people think and then defining the regulations in and around privacy, what you find is there are three basic categories of regulation. I've highlighted the number one most prevalent form of regulation. One, privacy reg is to help you promote electronic commerce. What many countries have found is that consumers don't like giving away information unless they feel somewhat protected. So privacy regulations really have nothing to do with the human right. It has everything to do with the economics. Second category is the pan-European laws. Now, Europe has always been, because of its history of World War II, has historically led the arena when it comes to privacy regulations. The EU has defined, with the exception of Ireland, which there's a little bit of an irony there, by the way, but with the exception of Ireland, all of the EU nations have instantiated by constitution that privacy is a fundamental human right. And in some jurisdictions, they've gone so far as to say people can have anonymity, not even privacy, anonymity. They can be wiped clean, off the slate. They don't have to exist. And then third is to remedy past injuries. This is where there's been human trafficking, sex slavery, all those kinds of things. You'll see a bunch of regulations. Now, why is it important? Why am I explaining this to you? I'm explaining this to you because as a practitioner, I have to understand this. Because if I'm working at a company like IBM that does business in 185 countries, guess what? I have to understand what the laws are in 185 countries so that I can implement effective security controls in order to enforce the privacy rights, but not get into a legal jam. So it's important to understand the why and the how. And so if you look at the world in general, this is just put this up very briefly, this kind of highlights where there are privacy regulations. So see US, in Argentina, in Brazil, in Russia, you have minimal restrictions on privacy. Places like Europe, you have very, very strong restrictions vis-a-vis privacy. In many of the Asian nations, there's just emptiness, right? And you've got some growing focus on privacy regulation, but by and large, it's a tapestry. And then within each of these countries, you further drill down, and there are lots and lots and lots of regs. So privacy, right of an individual, control your personal information, and assure that it's not disclosed, used, or modified by a third party without your permission. Now, this is important, because this is where security comes in. So now let's talk about security. You ever wanted to teach a class on what privacy actually means? If you were going to write a privacy regulation, I always believe in, you take all the regulations, you put them in a big box, you shake real hard, and you see what comes out the bottom. And if I look at all of the privacy regulations out there today, if I shook real hard, these are the things that would come out. And what a privacy regulation essentially says is, I have to, within an organization, define who owns the data. Okay, that makes sense. I've got to identify and document why it's being collected and used. I've got to make sure that the end user can consent to me collecting it. I've got to make sure that I'm only collecting that which I absolutely need for business purposes. I need to make sure I'm limiting how it's being used within the organization. I need to ensure that it's accurate. If I've got medical information, for instance, I have to make sure that it's not being changed erroneously. I have to implement safeguards. Guess what, guys? Security. Right here. That's security. Security is implementing safeguards. It's assuring that I have dealt with the confidentiality of that data, the integrity of the data, and the availability of the data. That's my obligation. I ensure only the people that need to have it have access to it, that it's not being changed, and it's always available. That is my job as a security practitioner. And then finally, I have to create a culture of openness so people know that if there is a breach, they can talk about it, and that there's recourse. If an end user has a complaint or a problem, they have a way of getting to me. That is a privacy regulation. So if you've ever wondered what the chief privacy officer does and how it's different from security, privacy officer is responsible for all that stuff. Security is only responsible for that one block, and security is responsible for assisting in the other areas, particularly when it comes to the areas of identification and documentation. Okay? That is security's role within privacy. Now, I thought this Dilbert was pretty funny because I think it talks a lot about the problem with security. Now, the problem with security is that as we implement the controls to assure confidentiality, availability, and integrity, oftentimes the controls that we implement create challenges. There are certain areas like monitoring, like decryption technologies, even role-based access controls, biometrics, that run afoul of certain privacy restrictions. Did you know that in places like Finland, an IP address is personally identifiable information? You can't even collect that. So you have to make sure, as you're implementing those security controls, you understand the privacy landscape, because oftentimes the controls you implement may create challenges. And we'll talk about that in just a sec. So here's another piece of education. This is very educational speech, by the way. I just want to give you a bit of a primer on how people like me think about security nowadays and the role of security. In my world, security plays a part in 4 risk areas. Now, what's important to understand about a risk officer is that, or a security risk manager or a CISO, is that at the end of the day, our responsibility is to be guardians of companies' funds and to assure that we're investing in the right places that are going to reduce the most risk. Now, from my perspective, there are 4 basic categories of risk. And this is very common across most enterprises. There is the risk of some sort of disruption or significant business outage caused by advanced threats, nation states, terrorist groups, hacktivists, etc. The buzzwords you're going to hear: cyber war, you're going to hear hacktivism. And this is all about assuring the infrastructure, assuring the longevity of the business. We'll talk about why this is keeping me up in a little bit. I'll give you some practical examples and some use cases. But this is the hot one. This is the one we're all going to be talking about over the next few years. Cyber espionage. This is stealing data so that you can create something like black market products. Cybercrime, stealing identities, stealing data for money laundering, fraud, opening up false bank accounts, all that kind of stuff. And then finally, privacy. Now, if you look down at the bottom, IT security, legal officer, financial crime unit, chief privacy officer, what you find is there are different owners within the company that own these categories of concern. Security really owns the cyber war unrest piece. Now, I've put IT security down there because the CISOs haven't necessarily woken up to this as a problem yet. You guys get it. We don't really get it. What we do own is cyber espionage. You hear crown jewels? Everybody cares about crown jewels today. Crown jewels, what is crown jewels? Crown jewels is the stuff that a company has from a data perspective that we actually care about. If we lost it, it would have a big impact on the business. I care about this now. Why? Because the SEC says I have to care. Would I care otherwise? I don't know. Cybercrime. Guess what? That's not in my bailiwick. Identity theft, fraud. I don't own that. The financial crimes unit owns that. That's a totally different group. I implement controls, but I'm reactive. I don't drive the strategy. Privacy, that's owned by the chief privacy officer. Now, I'm pointing this out because if you ever wonder why things are fragmented, why you're approaching things as if it's a firestorm, you've got your plan, you've got your strategy, you're going down a certain way, and then all of a sudden somebody comes in from the wings and says, no, you got to do it that way. That's why. There's this big map that the CEO has, and on that map they've got 4 blobs. Cyber war, cyber espionage, cybercrime, privacy. And you rack and stack them, and you say, which one is the most important to my business? And that's the one you focus on. And so if one of these goes to the top, it means all of my focus goes into that area. That's what we are at the beck and call of the overall risk organization who makes that definition. So from a practical perspective, what do businesses worry about? I think this is a good one. This is a good graphic. I like the stats from Hackmageddon. Personally, they do it on a month-to-month basis. I couldn't find the 2015 roll-up, but it was pretty similar. Cybercrime is the #1 issue. Identity theft, money laundering, it's all about the money. Has nothing to do with privacy. It has to do with the money. That's the #1 thing I worry about. #2 thing I worry about is hacktivism. Now, I think that this is a bit of an irony because hacktivists, I think this is really interesting and problematic with your age group, is, if you actually do a study of who are the hacktivists, there's really 2 basic groups of folks. One are those who believe that denial of service attacks are an appropriate form of civil disobedience. It's like a sit-in. And some academic studies have been done. They found that a huge proportion of college students believe that this is totally acceptable. So if you go to a telecom, any of you work at a telecom? No? If you've ever watched the stats, if you're sitting in a telecom NOC, and you're watching the stats and you're watching security incidents, what you find is Friday at 5 o'clock is inevitably when the denial of service attacks start. And why is that? Grabbing a beer in the dorm. You start your denial of service attack, woohoo. That's half that group. The other half the group is terrorist cells that are fronting social activist groups. I'm sure you guys have seen this in your own forensic investigation, but when we do our forensic analysis, what we tend to find is it's a good way of enrolling unsuspecting people into cybercrime is by creating that front. Next group is cyber espionage. That is increasing. And then finally, cyber war. Cyber war is the fastest growing category. And I'll explain why I think that is in a little bit. But this is the area we have to be really worried about. Used to be that less than a fraction of a % of all security incidents that we forensically examined could be tied back to cyber war. Now it's getting to be almost 8% over the course of 2 years. That's a big deal. All right, so let's talk about the reality. Now, when I sit down with my board, I don't have my head in the sand. I don't pretend that nothing's happened. In fact, these are the stats that we picked up from IBM last year, so I believe these stats because I actually put them together. What we were seeing is that an average enterprise, and an enterprise is about 10,000 seats, an organization of about 10,000 people, what you'll see is your systems, your event management systems, your monitoring systems will pick up about 1.7 million events. Now, of those 1.7 million events, 324 of those events were legitimate attacks. This is somebody or something was trying to get in. And then of these, what we were seeing is 2.1 of those each week would get into the institution and cause some sort of impact. Now, an impact didn't have to be, took down the entire organization or led to a huge breach. It really means that there was an incident, so somebody within the organization had to react to do something. So the way I would always use these statistics when I talk to a board is say, we're all infected. So if you think about security, you can't think about it within that defense in depth model that we used to think about, like putting a moat around the castle. I'm sorry, but that's all a bunch of crap. This is a biological model. We've all got viruses, we've got bacteria, and the reality is the job of a CISO is no longer to try to keep yourself in a plastic bubble. The reality is we've got to be able to differentiate between a common cold and the Ebola virus. That's our job. So we have to understand, of those 2.1 incidents per week, which one of those is noteworthy so that I can react to that. Noteworthy means it can have a material or significant impact on the business. Now, what does that mean? It means that there's a significant financial issue that has to go to the board. Now, when it comes to who's being attacked, finance and insurance, number one. This, number two, is the big deal and the big news, manufacturing. So you're seeing that increase from a cyber war perspective. That goes hand in hand. We're seeing a lot more focus, cyber espionage, so focusing on finding strategic plans, et cetera, as well as systems disruption, going after IoT. You know how they're going after IoT? They're going after the human management systems, so the control systems that manage the SCADA network, the SCADA environments. Those are usually sitting on the network, on the internet. Why? So the guys sitting in the operator booths, I've seen this I don't know how many times, they can watch movies when it's the middle of the night. So they're all accessible. But these are the top two: finance, manufacturing, information, retail, health, and social services. That all makes total sense. Now, let's talk about those 2.1 incidents. What those 2.1 incidents don't include are the, oops, I lost my laptop. I did something really dumb, like sent out a customer list to somebody I shouldn't have. I didn't report my laptop or my smartphone being stolen. For each one of the events, the attacks that you see that are sort of generated by somebody with malicious intent, there's another nine of them or so that are oops material. So when it comes to the what happened, the malicious intent, how did they get in? Malware infection, and I'll explain like that, my statistics, what people did to allow them to get in. So zero-day malware, access misuse, somebody used the same password that they used to buy shoes to administer a system, blah, 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 or a website compromise. That's the main way that they're getting in. Now, when you look at the who is perpetrating harm, when we did our analysis, what we found is, and these are worldwide stats, different patterns in different countries. Most of the attacks were being, the malicious attacks going back to those 2.1, those were being handled by outsiders. 10 years ago, this was very different. It would have been flipped between insiders and outsiders, but we've seen a decrease in the number of security events associated with insiders. Personally, I think it's because we've gotten better at controlling those kinds of those individuals within our organizations, but this could always change. And then what's really interesting is combination. We see a lot of system admins and people within the manufacturing organizations working in collusion with organized crime. This particularly happens in South America. What you see is during the holidays, an organized crime cartel will get in touch with you and say, hey, I'll pay you $1,500. All I need is your username and your password for a week. So while you're on holiday at Christmas, I mean, you're not even going to be working. Let me just use your username and password, and then when you come back, you can change it. Half now, half when you get back. We're seeing a lot of that happen. So this is an interesting one that bears paying attention to. Also seeing a lot of it in the call centers. I don't know if any of you are seeing a lot of more incidents in call centers, but wow. You know, these are lower paid people, pay them some money over the holidays, and it's a bonanza of usernames and passwords. Now, what is interesting to me, though, is if you look at all of these incidents and you were to do the forensic investigation, 95% plus, the reason the bad guy got in was because there was some dumb human who did something really dumb to let them in. Okay, human error was a contributing factor. So what did I see? The top reasons why the bad guys got in. Well, end users will double click on anything. They just can't help themselves. They'll disable security settings because they're a pain in the behind. They'll use legacy software. They won't patch it. They will use default passwords or use the same passwords that they use for business for personal use. See that again and again and again. And then as far as the sysadmins or developers, I love this one. They build within a cloud environment and they stick up the image. They do testing, in a cloud environment, and then it works really well. Then they put it right into production without realizing you actually needed a firewall in front of it before you put it in production during the testing process. Don't remove default accounts. Don't patch. Use legacy software. That's really not privileged users' faults or end users' faults. A lot of it is corporate just being cheap, not giving you upgraded stuff. And then using insecure remote management software. Those are the big ones. That's the why the bad guys got in. Okay, why is crime so easy? I'm not going to insult your intelligence. We all know because of the carding forums, et cetera. What I always think is really interesting is that, and this herein I'm going to introduce to you my theory as to why we should all be terrified about what's going to happen over the next few years. We all get that security incidents are driven by those individuals that are just trying to make money. A lot of it is just financially motivated. Anybody disagree with that? Now, it's a business. So let's talk about this business. How did it happen? Well, if you look at the rise of cybercrime, it's really interesting. I'm very analytical. I like to understand the why, because I believe you can't fix it unless you understand the why something's happening or why it works that way. And what I looked at is, and I found this one UN study, and it was the Office of Drugs and something or the other. They did this study on cybercrime statistics. And what they looked at is the correlation between the growth of internet access in nations where there is good basic education, very low opportunity, so high unemployment, low economic opportunity for the 17 to 35-year-olds. And what you see is there is a direct correlation between internet growth and cybercrime. And so the way it works is people within these nations, and I'll give you examples, Eastern Europe, Nigeria, places where most of the crime is emanating from today. You look at it, these nations were economically stagnant, lots of very highly educated people with internet access. What are you going to do to get out of a financial jam? Well, a lot of it was opportunistic, starts opportunistic. And then over time, it becomes much more organized. And so now the organizations that are, perpetrating harm, those that are writing the malware, creating the malware kits, et cetera, these are businesses. If you were to interview these folks, they don't think they're doing anything wrong. They're working for a business. It just so happens they're building tools with which you can create zero-day malware. They don't care what it's used for. And I'm sure you guys have heard all the stories about CryptoLocker, all the, the fact that those who are, provide the CryptoLocker out will, have customer service groups that are, great customer service. So I think, there is a direct correlation, at least I've seen, and the UN studies would back me up on this, there is a correlation between internet penetration in these kinds of countries and internet crime. Now, what's going to happen? This is the part that scares me to death. Where do you think a lot of the internet growth is going to happen over the next few years? Ideas? Well, let's put it this way. The Middle East has virtually no internet access. So even Iran, where you'll see on paper there's 40% internet access, that's not true. It's less than 4%. It's a very controlled environment. So we have places like Sudan, Yemen, Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, et cetera. Now, I'm not saying, and I'm not trying to point out that, the people that are living in these regions are terrorists. It's not what I'm saying at all. The fact is, though, that as you see internet growth, what you see is people organize. And what we've seen is there has been a growth in disruptive attacks coming out of the Middle East as internet penetration has increased in these nations. So if you talk about all of a sudden giving 10 to 20 million people within the age group of 17 to 35 internet access, what do you think is going to happen? Okay? A lot of them are not, they're not building, the technologies that are used for cybercrime. They're building technologies, a lot of the businesses are being built around systems disruption. So when I look at the world, the thing that keeps me up at night is IoT. I mean, look at the IoT. This stuff, I responded to an incident once. And this one really woke me up. It happened a couple of years ago. Healthcare institution, I can't say which one for obvious reasons. Healthcare institution, their hospital, and they were expanding coverage. They were servicing rural areas of the United States. And what they were doing is expanding physician coverage by doing things like putting in kiosks so you could talk to your doctor in the pharmacy or in the supermarket. They were sending out radiology machines into pharmacies. They were doing things like sending dialysis machines into the home setting, so instead of having to drive to a hospital that was 2 hours away, you could have dialysis, which is cleaning of your kidneys. You could do that at home. Well, in this particular instance, and this happens in most hospitals. Anybody work at a hospital? No? Okay, well, what happens is when you go into a hospital, you've all been to a hospital, I'm sure. When you go to, you see the nurses' station. Well, guess what's there at the nurses' station? The device, the HMI system, or the system that is used to manage things like dialysis machines, is at the nurse's desk. Oftentimes, those things aren't logged off. They're logged on. And in this particular case, what you had is a disgruntled employee, this was an orderly, not a nurse, but an orderly, who was mad and decided to shut off all the dialysis machines. So he went into the interface, which was not password protected, and he basically shut them down, rebooted them. And when you reboot them, like many IoT devices, when you reboot an IoT device, it comes up with the default password because it's a fail-safe mechanism, particularly with health devices, because in a home setting, if you're about ready to die because your dialysis machine isn't working, you want somebody like your wife to come in and reset it for you. You don't want complex passwords, so it resets with a default. This is typical. So when I think about IoT, and I think about the kinds of activities that we're seeing in the growth of destructive activities, it's one of the reasons why I wanted to be here today, is because I do think that you have such an important role in helping us to understand this kind of destructive malware in particular, which I think is going to be the real thing that we need to worry about. So, what are the things that I'm worrying about? What are the things that I am investing in? So I'm just going to give you a few sort of brief tidbits about my investment objectives. So there's two areas that I'm going to talk about, but I want to just highlight some of the other areas in general. Number one area that a lot of us are focusing on today is training employees. And you guys might think it's really dumb. Let me tell you, going back to a biological model, this is not about eradicating the risk, it's about reducing it statistically. Training employees does have a positive effect in decreasing the rate of incidents
because you're training your end users to double-click less frequently. I'm not saying it's perfect. The best you can ever hope for is to have about 60% of your employee base not do something really stupid. That's the best you can ever hope for, but it's better than 80%. And so that's what it's all about. It's about statistical reduction of the incident rate. You want to bring down your malware infection rate. Now, training without testing does not work. So you have to do social engineering, you have to do phishing tests, all that kind of stuff. I'm going to skip over number 2 and number 5 for the time being because I want to go into these in a little bit more depth. Adopt cloud, adopt mobile, adopt social. I have seen, again, going back to statistical sampling, the more you radically adopt these kinds of technologies, the better your overall security posture is going to be, for a couple of reasons. One is because your employees, like water, will find a way around the rules. And if you don't let them have access to mobile and social in particular, they're going to do it anyway. So it is better to give them controlled environments. So a lot of my investments are in bring your own device, which, by the way, statistically, you see a lot less security incidents on bring your own device than you see on a corporate device. I think it's because people care about their devices more, number one, and because number 2 is oftentimes we're using virtualization, and because you can zap the container, you're not getting as much lateral penetration. Cloud, why am I saying adopt cloud? I think cloud is really absolutely fascinating how it has changed us. Where did cloud come from? Cloud is very simple from an economics perspective. If I wanted, as a business owner, I wanted to go get an e-commerce application stood up or a new website stood up. The way I would do it 10 years ago is I would go to my chief financial officer and I'd say, can you put in this CapEx request? Here are my requirements. I'll give them to the CIO. He'll work with me. We'll build this application, la-di-da-di-da. It would take a year. Now with cloud, voila, stick in my credit card, 10 minutes later, I have an environment in which I can build. Now, that is leading to number 2, the requirement to move into or reorganize security to deal with agile DevOps, but I'll talk about that in just a second. But the reason why I'm a big believer in cloud is because cloud's like a mainframe. You can create a pattern, a security pattern, that is replicable. So you can create that pattern and then you can replicate it out to your cloud images, and if you're really good, you can actually delete and reuse images, which is really cool. Because if you're worried at all about zero-day malware infection, you get rid of it, you pull up the golden image, and you restore the image. Great. Number 4, mind the supply chain. This is really a compliance statement. Most regulatory authorities today are telling businesses to worry about your third-party partners because they are the source of a lot of your infections. So now I want to go back to number 2 and number 5. So don't be surprised, guys. Security is changing from an organizational perspective. Remember I said cloud is an economic sort of result? Well, what is cloud allowing? Cloud is introducing now Agile and DevOps. Because now I have the infrastructure available to me, what I can do is I can build more quickly. How many of your organizations have adopted Agile? The rest of you on waterfall? Oh my God. Okay. Well, it's happening. You probably just don't know what's happening yet. But most organizations are, if they haven't actively adopted it, they've got a skunkworks project where they're adopting Agile right now. What is Agile? Agile is development on steroids. It just happens really quickly. Now, what I've seen in Agile is that because the way security is built is security is very policy-oriented. We write a policy, we write a configuration document, we assume people are going to follow it. It doesn't work in an Agile world. So because it doesn't work in an Agile world, we, security, have to change what we do. So a lot of security organizations are being dismantled today. and they're being radically changed so that the security organization goes from an organization which was policy and response to an organization which is much more engaged and active, providing consultation services and testing services. Good news for you guys. You will be employed for a really long time. Because what I did when back in IBM, and this is what I advise a lot of boards and organizations on today, is that the organization needs to change such that you've got a very, very, very small group at top that kind of understands, sort of the overall architecture of the organization. But most of the people that you've got are in coaching, advising, and frankly, testing. So what we would do, or what I would do in IBM, is I took all of my people and I would put them into the agile teams, into the development teams. They lived with them, they worked with them, they went through the whole process with them. I usually had one architect and I had a tester. And I made available a core set of tools. Think about it almost like a cyber range, a set of tools that each of those individuals can use within those teams. But what I would do is, as part of the minimal viable product, as part of the agile process, there was a requirement that security needed to be built into the software code. And so what we would do is assure that the individuals who were the advisors were doing the testing, assuring the minimum viable product, then it was ready for production. But that was the concept. Many organizations are changing into this model. That typical centralized policy, SOC response is going away. Now, that's not to say that you're not going to have a SOC. So let's talk about the SOC. So how many of you guys are doing incident response? Okay. So from an organizational perspective, lots of money is going into this area. And I personally think, and this is why I actually left IBM, is there are some areas, there is some technology here that are unspeakably cool that are coming out. So let me go through what the SOC looks like today. This is the more of the high-level architectural view of what a security operations center platform looks like. On top of this, you're going to have people operating via some sort of analyst rule set. So what happens is at the bottom, you've got all of your, your active defense and defense capabilities. I kind of love that term, active defense. So you've got all of these capabilities. You've got your monitoring technologies. You've got your traditional network defense technologies. You've got your host-based defense technologies. You've got your vulnerability scanners and other kinds of assessment capabilities, hopefully in an integrated platform, not always. All of the events coming from these technologies are going into a data warehouse. That's shooting from a data warehouse into an event management or some sort of analytics engine like a Splunk. And on top of it, you've got an analyst workbench, the cyber range, if you will, with lots and lots of different types of tools that are being integrated in that platform that people from the incident response team and others, either the hunter team or the responder team, are using in order to test the issues that they're seeing coming from the event platforms. Now, from my perspective, and here's where I'm going to sort of pull the things together, I actually believe that so we were talking about how complex privacy is. I believe that in today's world, there are ways that we can solve, from a security perspective, a lot of our privacy problems, not stamping on what it means to, meet those regulatory aims, but we can solve those problems and do a really good job at it. So let me talk about threat detection for a second. So anybody playing with machine learning? How's your response so far? Okay? All right. There's some stuff coming out now. It's incredibly cool. Okay. Honestly, yes. I took over a company that's doing this, but I did it because when I was at IBM, We had a really bad incident. We had gotten called by the feds saying that something had happened in one of the customer environments, and for the love of heaven, we couldn't figure it out. So we took in a tool, put it into our network, and we found stuff we'd never seen before. It was just amazing. But the way machine learning works is there have been a number of R&D projects over the past 5 years as part of something called the Malware Genome Project. I don't know if any of you have heard of it. Funded multinational focus looking at zero-day malware, essentially. And the concept with machine learning was to take an engine, and so think about this as like facial recognition. So facial recognition is essentially a machine learning technology. And so what it does is you teach the system to understand faces, and then you're able to give it a piece of data, and it's able to identify within all of that GORP, you're able to find that one picture or the sort of the elements of that picture that you're looking for. Now, what happens in machine learning is over 5 years, and there's multinational focus on this, good software and bad software was fed into this project. So now there are machine learning technologies out there that can differentiate between good, well-written software and malware incredibly quickly. So instead of using dynamic analysis engines, so people have heard of sandboxes, there's FireEye, there's Cisco, there's Blue Coat, there's WebSense. Lots of people have sandboxes today that do dynamic execution. What happens is, those technologies, they sit on the network, they see something kind of weird, they pull it off into a sandbox and it automatically executes the code. What machine learning will do is machine learning will operate at network speed, and do sort of the classification of all of the events. Now, here's the interesting part. It never looks at the actual data. It's only looking at the code. So from a privacy perspective, this becomes really interesting because it's almost impossible to violate any of the regulations regarding non-view of PII because it's all based on the code. Now, what's really interesting about these machine learning engines as well is my company, other companies will actually have created platforms where it's not just the machine learning engine that's working at wire speed, but you can also run things like, anybody familiar with Bro? Yep. So this is built on a Bro analysis engine. You can write the Bro rules, Yara rules, ClamAV, Metasploit, third-party intel sources. All of these things can be integrated running in parallel at wire speed. So last year, the best we could hope for with our dynamic approaches or our signature-based approaches was to find maybe 50 to 60% of zero-day malware in the wild. Today, you can find 98% or more. There's still issues. I mean, there's still going to be holes. Not going to find everything. But you can find 98%. Last year would take you 11 hours. This year it'll take you 11 milliseconds. So you're talking about just a radical jump forward in capabilities of doing zero-day malware detection. So I'm actually really excited about the advances in machine learning. They're not there yet. It's not there 100%. But for the folks that are sort of in your chairs, I would start looking at it, particularly look at Bro. If nothing else, just start with Bro. But I would be looking at it because there's a lot of talk about it, and it's not just talk. There's a lot of value and valid information coming out of these technologies. So I am going to end. I've left a few minutes for some questions. But my point, just to summarize, privacy is kind of sketchy. Nobody knows really what it means. Lots of regulations. You understand where security fits within that context. And, the big issue from a security and privacy perspective is really around the monitoring. I really think that there is going to be a sea shift as we move into the next few years. There's two reasons why people like me get to spend money. Crisis. The board, read a news article and they scared them, so they called me and said I had to spend money. That happened, for the past few years. Now we're moving into a compliance orientation. A lot of legislations are coming up with new cyber laws that are dictating what we need to do. One of those things, by the way, is black swan events. So just so you understand, that's what the theory is, that the EU is going to be promulgating a reg on the cyber side that requires black swan testing of all enterprises. And we believe that most nations are going to adhere to that particular requirement. I do think that capabilities like machine learning are going to change the way we do security. I think it's going to be incredibly valuable. And I do think, but at the end of the day, this is all about building security inside. So the more we can focus on DevOps, agile, building security within the software, the better it'll be. So that's it. I am going to now take questions. So anybody have any questions? Yes.
With respect to privacy, is it working? Yeah. So, for example, but the first place where we start violating our privacy is already security conferences. Nowadays, every single talk at every tiny conference is recorded and stored. Now, when I give workshops, it's already recorded in any company. Oh, some of my employees cannot attend. We record your workshop. It's only for internal purposes. So, and for example, I'm doing SCADA security. There are only a bunch of us who is doing that. And it's incidents, it's a classified information. Like, we try to share with each other maybe some details, so, you know, obviously without releasing, but still, you know, like, I'm becoming extremely paranoid to say something wrong because I know that I'm recorded. So even I have to, while going on the stage, I have to filter my talk so much, and I'm really becoming paranoid. So we start violating privacy already here at the security conferences. And the second thing which I wanted to say, I really like this, that yeah, we're having a rising problem from middle, like East Europe, like all those, or then Middle Asia, Middle East. But the problem is also in what I see also in the Western world, companies don't know how to treat hackers. They don't know how to hire them and how to retain them within the organization. Most of my friends, they are freelancers. And then you work on some great projects because companies, they don't want to understand us. And as Dylan said, like, we're sometimes a little bit awkward and strange, but that's why we're doing what we're doing. So in the companies, yeah, they think that hackers, somebody has to be in a suit, being able to speak to the customer and whatnot. So most prefer to work from home.
Yeah, and I want to touch on that last point because I think you're on a really important point. There is a huge generational gap in security. Huge. And it's actually, we're going to be talking tomorrow on, you know, sort of diversity, and I was mentioning it earlier. It's not just women being integrated in teams or people of different, you know, religious or ethnic backgrounds being integrated in teams. It's generations being integrated in teams. I can tell you that if I have worked for companies, seen companies where, frankly, and forgive me, but the security program is, and the security managers are pretty much all older white guys. And they have they come from defense and intel, and they have a very specific approach. And to them, it's lock it down, lock it down, lock it down, lock it down. They don't get it. And, you know, I've always advocated, I'm more of a proletariat when it comes to managing my teams. You got to have people from different vantage points providing a perspective because you need different thinking. And I can tell you, you know, having been, you know, in your shoes, having worked from home, it is tough managing you guys, right? It is. I mean, there's and when I, you know, sort of came up in the ranks, you know, there was an expectation you'd go to the office, you'd wear a suit. You guys, you could be working, backpacking in Nepal. I don't know where you are. And you know what? I shouldn't care. So I had to, you know, as I got more mature in my own career, I began to realize that, you know, a good security manager has to recognize the DNA of the people that work with them. And I've always had this sort of philosophy that I don't care where my people work as long as they work. I don't care when they work as long as they work. I care about the outcome. I don't care about how many hours you put in. So if you can get your job done in 3 hours, God bless. But there's sometimes that you might be working, 48 hours straight, and that's my expectation. But I do think that today, in the security world, there is a generation gap. There is a gap. What I want to see, though, is more of you guys thinking about what's your career path, a little bit of mom education, right? Because at the end of the day, somebody's got to replace me. So which one of you is it? Right? I want you to think about that. What are you going to be when you grow up? And I think that if you can also, so it's a two-way street. I think the more you can integrate and understand, and that's why I wanted to spend time talking about it, from the mom perspective, how I see it as a CISO. Because for you to be successful, you have to know how I think. And for me to be successful, I have to know how you think. So I think, great point, but we got to converge.
Wondering if you could kind of clarify. Initially during the talk, you were speaking about that you had to deal with 185 countries, different regulations and rules regarding privacy or security. But then you also just said that you don't care where your workers are working. Well, if they're into a country that you don't already have regulation clearance or data privacy rules are going to conflict and there's going to be customer data there, then you do have to care where your employers are working.
No, I think that you're right. And so when I say I don't care, I don't care, right? They can work anywhere. Now, could they work from North Korea? Probably not. Do I care about what kind of devices that they're using when they're in those countries? Sure I do. And so, my approach has always been, and just from a more pragmatic perspective, when I look at the engineering organizations, the system developers, administrators, folks like you, I always classified the users within my company with different risk profiles. So I had sysadmins and others who have systems access and developers who have systems access. I have regulated data users. I have the general population, and I have the senior vice presidents that have a completely different user profile. And then what I would do is, so I had those different user profiles to say higher risk, medium risk, low risk, weird risk. And of those user profiles, I tiered countries. And I'd have like tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. And then what I would do is I would map what you needed to do based on who you were. And so if I had an employee who came to me, and I've literally had this happen, say I'm going to be hiking base camp to Everest, I need access, what would I do? You sort of have to look and say, okay, tier 3, country base, system, system admin, how do you marry the two together? And sometimes there are differences, but I think what you find is most of the time it's not a technology-based issue. It's really more of a policy issue that needs to change. But I can talk to you more about that on break. But suffice to say, you're right. You do care, but not that much.
So on the career path in being a CISO, we got organizations in Asia who say, come to us in 3 years, we'll train you to be a CISO.
Yeah, good luck with
right
that.
Out of college.
Mm-hmm.
And it's becoming a big market, and they've got lots of students there. What do you think the risk of that is going to be besides having people who are not qualified to climb Mount Everest, being on top of Mount Everest, and using your Mount Everest analogy?
Yeah, well, I'd say, first of all, that's false promises. It's one of those, call now and you can make $100 million. I don't believe it. But so for anybody who wants to be a CISO, in order to be an effective CISO, there's really two things that you need. And I don't care what people promise you. To be a good CISO, you need to understand the business. You have to understand how business works. So stretch yourselves and take a business class. Finance Management 101, Accounting Management 101. Just understand how business works. That's number one. Number two, take a PowerPoint presentation class or some other speaking class, because the most important thing is that you learn how to communicate effectively. Business people like to talk in big pictures, not little pictures. They get lost in the weeds. And so to be effective, you really have to focus there. Unless these 3-year training programs are integrating, finance management and presentation, PowerPoint skills, I'm not sure it's going to get there, but that's just me. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kristin.